Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master, Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was... Nobody expects the Torque Inquisition.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Torque Inquisition. Yeah, that's our new intro. That was fun, right? It makes you think you're going to be actually listening to something intelligent and important, and not that you aren't, John, but intelligent and important when it comes to reading through the Silmarillion. But no, this is the Torque Inquisition, where we like to interview other creative people who are involved in Tolkien and creativity, and that sort of layer of people influencing others to read good things and write good things and do things like that, and take a perspective that isn't necessarily the standard Hollywood perspective on things. So today, I'm with Michael Grumbine down below. Hi, Michael. Nice to see you. Nice shirt.
Hello,
I have that shirt too, if you're on YouTube looking at this here.
I'm glad it wasn't too awkward when we both wore it at the same time.
I know, yeah. That one time we went to a movie together and wore the same shirt, standing too close together. Anyway, sorry. No, I digress. With us today, we have John Carswell, who is also a Tolkien podcaster, but he's got way more experience than either of us do, and than Michael already. He's been doing it for 7 years now, John, I think?
Early 2015. So
wow,
it's
8 years almost.
8 years, yeah.
Dang.
Yeah.
So 8 years, which is about 8 times longer than we have. And it's at the
steal all the secrets.
Yeah, it's called the Tolkien Road. Mm-hmm. And you still haven't run out of material. That's impressive. You can go to the TolkienRoad.com or just TolkienRoad.com, right? I think that's
TolkienRoad.com. Yeah, TolkienRoad.com.
Yeah. And
that website needs a redesign.
Yeah, it's all right. You can click listen. You can become a Patreon there. You can do all sorts of things. I mean, you've been doing it for a long time. Like you don't need a good website anymore.
That's good. Just throw them up there. That's right. It
comes from somebody who's probably worked on them in the past. Anyway, so this is exciting. So last year I found out, I think, John, you first reached out to me because I moved to Middle Tennessee in 2021. And I don't know, through Twitter or something like that, I had where I lived in Middle Tennessee is like the city. And you were like, hey, you live like a few miles from me, 10 miles from me or something like that. We should get together. And so we had breakfast like 6 or 7 months ago. And then we stopped talking. And now we're back. So, and then we saw the Rings of Power, and then we're back. So anyway, but that was cool. You know, we totally came at Tolkien a little differently. I was younger. He was older. He was the movies, but he had experienced more in life before me. But I think it both hit us in a very similar. I don't know what's the best word. Creatively, spiritual, very basic. Like it hits your core, right? Like when you read it,
that's right.
Time through. So we kind of hit it off, and now we found out that Michael and John have like 1 degree of separation in the folks that they know, which was kind of cool. Yeah. But John, before we jump into all the interpersonal relationships we have to deal with and settle here, I want to ask you first, how did you get started into Tolkien? Like, where did you go to find your love for Tolkien first?
So it really goes back to the Fellowship of the Ring, the Peter Jackson film in 2001, and seeing it. So I had never read the books before. Was encouraged to go see the movie. You know, it was kind of it was obviously a pretty big deal at the time. So I went to see it, and just within 15 minutes was just like, this is incredible. Loved the movie, just everything about it. And between so that was like December of 2001, and then between then and when The Two Towers came out the following December 2002, I think I read Lord of the Rings twice.
Wow.
Read it and just dove in and found in the book just something that seemed amazing. Was listening, this is before the days of podcasting, but you can still get your hands on like people giving lectures and that kind of thing. I remember listening to people like Peter Kraft talk about like Lord of the Rings and that kind of thing, and Tolkien's worldview and all those sorts of things. And I was just like, this guy, there's something special going on there, and just found myself really drawn to whatever this vision was that was in there. So, and I was thinking, because you all were doing the OneRing.com back then, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, since 1999.
Yeah, and I do remember like going, back in this is early days of the internet, really, but like going to the OneRing.com and whatever y'all were posting there at the time, just looking for any information from other people about Tolkien.
So, maps, right? That's the favorite
the complete
one.
List of film changes. Yeah, that's still, I mean, those are still the two big things. But yeah. I mean, we still have like in archive mode, like 17,000 articles on the site, which
wow,
it wasn't just me, it was a number of people, but I can't nobody reads anymore. That's why we do podcasts.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately. Yeah. No, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So you read it twice, which is interesting because a lot of people will see the movie and not actually jump right into the books, especially if the movie is good. I feel like there are a lot of people who would be watching and be like, wow, that was a great movie. Let me watch it again. Not, wow, that was a great movie. Let me go read the books. Is that how you, how does that happen? Because generally if I see a good movie, it's like, I saw the Da Vinci Code, I thought it was fine. And I'm not like, oh, I'll go read a book.
For me, it was just like, I wanted to know what happens because, the Fellowship of the Ring ends on kind of the film ends on kind of a cliffhanger. Okay. And so I'm like, I wanted to know what happens. And I also knew people who were recommending the books to me and like, just saying like, if you like the movie, the books are even better. You really need to read the books. People who had read the books, been fans of Tolkien for a long time. And they just came highly recommended. And, it's one of these things where, I mean, the first time you read Lord of the Rings, it's a little, unless you're, some people are, can just read anything, but like it's a little challenging the first time you read it, like to get into it. But once you hit your stride, it's hard to put down. You get a few chapters in, you experience Tom Bombadil for the first time, and then maybe you get beyond that, and you're like, okay, now
weirdness is in the past, and
now this is all starting to be really interesting. Of course, you come back later and you realize that Tom Bombadil is like one of the greatest of Tolkien's inventions. You just didn't know enough to appreciate him at the time. So, not dissing Tom Bombadil. That's my point.
No.
We don't diss Tom Bombadil. We might occasionally poke fun at his color choices, but
right, yeah. You got to have fun with him. I mean, he's a fun character.
He's a fantastic character.
Yeah. So, okay. So you read it twice, which is in 1 year, which is impressive. Cause I mean, that's, 1,300 pages and maybe you didn't read anything else if you're, anyway, but you were also at the time, right? Were you in the Navy then, or what was your status? Cause you've come around to creating a podcast in a very windy path. I think it hasn't exactly been direct.
Well,
would you say it's been a windy Tolkien road?
That's right. A long and winding Tolkien road.
So ever on and on.
That's right. So I was a first class midshipman at the Naval Academy when Fellowship of the Ring came out in theaters. So I graduated that May, went into the submarine force out of the Navy. Was in the Navy for the next 6 years until 2008, and then I got out of the Navy. Had probably read Lord of the Rings a couple more times during that period. Watched the movies a ton. Was always was listening to you guys, your most recent episode, talking about the. I only watched the extended editions, and I was one of those people. I was like, only watch the extended editions, right?
Absolutely.
And so anyway, I got out of the Navy, moved to Middle Tennessee, where I live now, and had a job. Got a job. Went back to school. Had a little bit of money with like a post 9/11 GI Bill, so I went back to school and got a master's degree in English, and for my master's thesis, wrote really focused on Tolkien. Was reading a lot of Tolkien. Really wanted to understand more deeply like what was going on with his with his works, and that's been like my project ever since. Is just like, what is the Tolkien thing? Like, what is that thing that makes his writing so special? That's draws so many people to them. And just has this strange power upon so many people. Just affects people so deeply in their souls.
Us Reformed Tolkien people, we call it the Tolkien-shaped hole in your heart.
That's right.
Oh no.
It's true though. It's something Michael and I and Dan have talked about in the past, that once you read Tolkien, you start reading other books, you're like, this just isn't. It's fine, but it's not great. It's okay. It's good, and it's maybe bordering on, but it's just not the same, right? It's something like I think Tolkien was the only book where I ever got choked up. I don't get choked up or cry very easily, but when Boromir died, like I had to like reread that like 3 times because I couldn't fathom him dying right then and there, especially in Defense of the Hobbits. So Yeah. So, but you went to school for this. You went like you spent a ton of extra money just to figure it out.
Well, it's a GI Bill, right?
GI Bill. Well,
Yeah, yeah.
Still,
Well,
time is money. So
I spent Uncle Sam's money on figuring.
our money, Michael.
Well spent.
Our money.
Well spent.
But
well spent.
but I earned it. I did earn it. So
You did.
I know.
no. So yeah. I mean the program wasn't all focused on Tolkien, but when it came time to be able to choose what I wanted to, really study towards the end of that program, I chose diving into Tolkien. One of the other things I did was, so kind of the question I was exploring was just kind of the general, like, how does he create this verisimilitude, right? Like this feeling of reality within his works. Mm-hmm. I also, during that time, finally, like it was also a really good excuse to force myself to read the Silmarillion for the first time, because I tried and failed a couple of times. And so I did. I made it through one time, and then I was like, okay, I've made it through the first time. Now I can start to understand it. So I probably read it again, and then I had an opportunity to present at a conference, and really loved the story of Beren and Luthien. So I told this. I wrote a paper on the story of Beren and Luthien, and then it was shortly after that. So that's getting up to 2014, and shortly after that, there were some kind of different things that happened as far as my job situation, and I had some time off, and I was like, I'm going to start this podcast. So and publish this book, publish this paper, long paper I wrote as a book, and that's how it all got started as far as the Tolkien Road goes.
So if you had to sort of summarize in a sentence or two where you think the greatness of Tolkien lies, why is the Tolkien, let me back up a second. One of the things that I've found the hardest to explain to adults in my life is my love for Tolkien. And I found I'm not ashamed of it, but it especially as Americans, we have little appreciation, I think, for that type of literature, except as children's literature. That's what everyone defaults to. And they don't take it seriously. But in fact, in my view, and I have reasons, but my view is that it's a book, it's a work that in fact is of the most serious nature. It's the kind of work that gets at the heart of reality under a certain mode. But I'm kind of curious, if you were to explain what is the draw from Tolkien, why has he touched the hearts of everyone from the young to hippie college students in the 60s, much to Tolkien's chagrin, to professors of English and very serious types, to the masses. I remember I was in England in 2000, and the British press was very irritated that the people of Britain voted Tolkien the #1 novel of the 20th century. They were highly irritated about that. The literati of England were. So he has this broad appeal. Where do you think that lies?
Well, I will say brevity on this subject is not my strong suit, because as you'll notice, I've done over 300 hour-long episodes. So, yeah, I mean, I feel like that's the project. I'm just like on a journey to figure out and put into words, and put it into words in a way that does it justice. I think that there's something mystical going on in what he was doing, and that's why it's so hard to put into words. I'll stop there. Does that sound too crazy? Does that sound too crazy? Do you feel a ring of truth to that?
No, it doesn't. I mean, so as a Roman Catholic, when I see there are elements in his which he is deliberately touching on the mystical. There's elements that are sacramental, in fact, in his work, but that's not something I can usually bring up in polite conversation, and doesn't get much play amongst my Protestant brethren. So that the sacramental part anyway, but the mystical part might, and the theological part definitely does, since we're about to interview a guy a Baptist that in fact wrote a whole book on Tolkien's theology, and he did an excellent job, actually. And so there is something beyond this isn't just fiction writing. It isn't even just excellent fiction. It isn't even just myth the language of myth, which it is definitely the language of myth, but it isn't just that. I feel.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the Lord of the Rings is something he worked on for his entire adult life. And now maybe we should expand that to say the legendarium of Middle Earth, of which the Lord of the Rings is the crown jewel, the crowning achievement of it all.
That's right. That's right.
He maybe had hoped that the Silmarillion was going to be, but the Lord of the Rings, everybody loves hobbits, so he had to write a new Hobbit that really expanded upon the legendarium he had already been creating. I find his letters and his nonfiction writing helpful in putting into words, his own words, what he was doing. And see, the problem is, I'm not even really sure he had the words to express what he was doing. I think he was following his muse throughout his life, and his faith, he did not see it he grew into seeing it totally as something in sync with his faith. And through that process, he discovered these incredible truths about human creativity and how our creative tendencies are not necessarily these sort of like, things over here that you kind of like have to keep in the corner because they're not really that important. That our creative tendencies are there's something of like the divine fire within us, right? Like the whole idea of sub-creators, right? Of sub-creation, different terms that he coined, the idea of eucatastrophe, just that the happy turn of tying his legendarium in subtle ways, not putting a fine point on it, but in subtle ways tying his legendarium into our reality by way of little hints of the gospel here and there. I hate even saying like little hints of the gospel because that makes it sound like he's like putting little things over here. Like it's really like he saw it as taking place. It's like a almost like a proto gospel, right? Or another Old Testament, right? Like from some other angle, right?
Yeah, and lest folks think the Christian followers of our podcast think that we're straying into the sacrilegious. The way I see that is, it's the Gospels themselves are like the deepest of background thrums in music, and when you can tie your harmony to that and you match that, when the frequencies match as you in certain touch points of the story, and I know I just used music as an example to explain. Then there's that most Tolkienian of realities that you've created in literature, which is the type, right? The echo through the ages. Like everything in his work echoes. When you read the Silmarillion, you begin to appreciate exactly how many echoes there are, in fact, in the Lord of the Rings, which you rightly call the crowning jewel, but yet there's the full appreciation of the crowning jewel, as attractive as it has been to the masses. The full appreciation of it is not possible without reading the history, even though that most people can't make it through, especially not in the first try.
Yeah, I really liked your idea of the sound of like, the thrum or the bass line in between, that everything has to, so if the bass line is off, everything else is going to be horrible. But, if the piccolo is slightly off, then maybe you can run back into it. But in any case, like the whole idea of the bass line, right? And this comes to the book that we're going to read, the author we're going to interview in our next interview, a book called Tolkien Dogmatics. Is that right? That's right? Anyway, and he brings up this line about he writes this page 68 of 623. If you really want to get deep into Tolkien. He writes this: was Tolkien inspired? No, not if one means by this that Tolkien was somehow bestowed inerrant divine authority to deliver a message purporting to be from God. But in the Catholic milieu of which Tolkien was a part, it is not unusual to find persons specially gifted or guided by God outside the pages of the Holy Scriptures. And he brings up Cadman of, you might have heard the band Cadman's Call, a Christian band from like the 90s that was popular at the time. But Cadman is a guy in Old English, if I'm remembering all this right, who a poet who suddenly had, or not even a poet, he suddenly had like divine inspiration and he could not stop singing. That was his thing. And so he had this call to write. And so I feel like there are people like Tolkien, like Cadman, separated by over 1,000 years, who they're able to feel that thrum a little bit more, right? And somehow that is then like we feel that too, and it's really hard to put into words. Like all the time, it's hard to put into words. I can't get my wife to read The Lord of the Rings. How do I explain this to her? Right? That's my thing. So
I couldn't even get my kids to read The Lord. I had to get my wife on the podcast to get her to read it. She actually had read it a couple of times, but to get her to read Silmarillion, I had to get her.
Oh, that's rough.
To get her on the podcast.
Yeah. Eventually.
I go old school Catholic. I have. My kids have to participate if they want other things that are in life, like screen time. My children have to. My boys have to write me in Tengwar what they've done and accomplished for the day, and why they should get screen time before I say yay or nay.
Yeah.
So I get these elvish notes on a regular basis.
Well, that that is interesting. That speaking of significant others, that you do the podcast with your wife, which is
how did you do it?
Yeah. So did she read Lord of the Rings, and how did you were you like, hey, let's do this? Nobody's going to listen to it, or were you like, hey, let's do this? It's going to take up way too much time, and you're not going to see me anymore.
Yeah. Well, I unfortunately I didn't like have any like buddies that were, and this is going back several years, but I didn't have any buddies who were like super nerds when it came to Tolkien stuff like I was, right? And definitely nobody who would want to spend weekly hours going through Silmarillion, Lord of the Rings, all of that chapter by chapter. So our kids were a lot younger at the time, and it was just kind of like, hey, I don't want to just be the only person on there talking, because that'll get boring for people. It's more interesting normally when you've got a conversation going on. So, so I just, was like, hey, let's just start doing this. Just start reading chapter by chapter. All I need you to do is read and then show up, and I'll kind of lead the conversation, and we can just get it going. So it worked. It worked, and people really seem to enjoy it. Over time, it's so. As of late, she isn't on as much as she has been in the past. That's more just a function of like changing. I mentioned to you guys my daughter heading off to college, and so there's just changing family dynamics and that kind of thing. But she comes back on from time to time. But right now I'm going through the Fall of Numenor by myself. Just kind of trying to. First of all, it came out, and I'm like, second of all, it'll be helpful to maybe use this to correct some of the errors from the TV show. So, or just some of the things the directions they went that just, they could have gone other directions.
I thought they went back to the book.
Yeah. Tell me when you get to that part where they're scared of the elves taking their jobs. That's
You never read that part before?
No, I missed that. I missed it somehow.
Well, so I'm just curious. I'm always curious about this. So you're, deep into Tolkien. I mean, I would say that like they're kind of like three levels of Tolkien fans. There's the original level, or who maybe read the book once or saw the movies and like, hey, that was great, and I'm not going to jump into it. There's a lot of people like that who love the Lord of the Rings, but they tried the Silmarillion and they're, oh no way, I can't do that. It's not me anymore. But then there's like, I think those of us who have read the Silmarillion, and this is this is all on a spectrum, who love it and really enjoy it. And actually, the more you read the Silmarillion, the more you get out of it. Or the more you read the histories of Middle-earth and things like that, the more you get out of it, because the investment is greater and the payoff is greater. Mm-hmm. And then you have I would say the other folks who do this for a living and write books, long books, teach classes. Right there, there's that level where it is an academic pursuit. Mm-hmm. But what kind of people actually like the Rings of Power? Because I don't think it's any of those kinds of people, right? Anybody who actually read the Lord of the Rings. I mean, I don't know. Like, that's the thing. It's like, how many people do we know that jumped into it and were like, this is great? I don't know anybody. And
any praise I've heard of it has been very like kind of qualified praise, or almost kind of like, I just kind of like it. I just kind of like watching it,
Yeah.
And like with when we did our reviews, we reviewed each episode. And it was funny, like, and Greta's usually like a much less dogmatic about Tolkien things than I am, but she just hated it. And she loved the Peter Jackson films. So I was not a fan of the Rings of Power either. But as we went through it, we've been doing the podcast a long time, so there's a lot of people who listen, and there's a lot of people who listen that probably just love it that there's another excuse.
Yeah, anything is good.
In Middle Earth, even if it's kind of subpar Middle Earth,
vicariously,
yeah.
Subpar right through Rings of Power. I try not to get too heavy on but when we did our reviews, I just kind of went through scene by scene and was just here it is, and I if there was things I took issue with, I would state what that problem was.
You were definitely much more diplomatic about it than I probably was.
Yeah, well, just having been doing the podcast for so long, there's just so many different people listening, and I didn't want to just spend the whole time trashing it. I didn't want to hold back either in terms of my criticisms of it, because I did have strong criticisms of it. Right. So it's kind of okay, I'll mention one or two things that I kind of liked about the episode, and then it's let's talk about all the things that were wrong with it.
It's hard to do. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, right? If you've read Tolkien, if you've gone through the similar in particular, right? I think their assumption was that most people don't know this stuff, so we're just going to make up mithril, right? So we're just going to pretend that the distances on the oceans and the land doesn't matter, and that Elrond and Celebrimbor can walk across in their robes of windows, their curtains, anyway, and walk over to Khazad-dûm and just stroll back. Right? It was
over there. It's just right over there. Yeah.
And if you know that, then right away, you're triggered. You're like no, you can't do this. No, and everything was like that with us.
It was just so frustrating because there was so much money spent on this thing. And you could not get the artistry right. I get it that you can't spend. You've got 8 episodes in one season to work with, and you've got constraints. I get that you have constraints, but the best artists within Hollywood in their various fields, they know how to tell a good story and tell it within the confines, the limits that are placed on them. Right.
Exactly.
The funny thing for me is, and I like this little analogy. I'm a huge fan of the Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul universe.
Me too.
And it's probably at this point my favorite 2 favorite TV shows. And it takes place in New Mexico, which is the land of enchantment. And what I love about it, one of the things I realize I love about it is I'm totally enchanted by it, right? And enchantment is this key thing when it comes to Tolkien's artistry. He talks about it on Fairy Stories as being one of the chief qualities that you have to achieve with good fantasy, with good fairy tales, in order for them to reach kind of the standard that he has in mind. If you're just going for suspension of disbelief, then you're falling short.
Right.
And that was the best that I could do with the show was suspension of disbelief. Even just looking at the land of Numenor, for example, right? Galadriel goes on a weird horse ride across from one end to the other, right? And which they never tell us that she's going from. It's never they never actually tell us anything about Numenor. It's just here's Numenor, here's old Numenor, right?
Yeah.
This little place right here, and it's is that Romena? It must be Romena because that's that's a port city. It could be there are some other port cities. It's not Armanelos, right? But you're making it look like Armanelos because this is where the throne is.
Exactly.
And then she goes on a horse ride, which apparently is all the way across the island, and that's 600 miles.
Oh my God.
But it's just going on a little horse ride.
Right.
Just little things, little notes like that.
But I wouldn't even call those little, John. I just and that was an unintended Robin Hood reference. They were so basic. They even got into it that kind of thing. It's the reason I agree with you so much about that point about Numenor is because this is what makes Tolkien's works so compelling is that he has this detail, and he wasn't perfect. He didn't not make any mistakes, but he had such a devotion to the richness and building the background, that it is a deep disservice to his literature to ignore all that. So that's fine. That's one thing. That's like for the real Tolkien nerds, we get worked up about that stuff. But then you get to places like when the Númenóreans are coming to save a village that they don't even know exists and is under attack, which is hilarious that they would be charging across the mountain. But they literally say it's going to take us 3 days or 2 days to make this travel. And then one night later, they arrive. Right. So they can't even pay attention to their own dialogue from the previous episode and make sure that it's, I mean, I don't know who the quality control people were or weren't.
Yeah, I mean, this is why Tolkien is so good, because he slaved over the details. There's a quote that I posted to Twitter a while back, which was, "This map is hell," because he couldn't make the map work exactly as he wanted to. He had to keep shifting things, and like the time it took them to cross certain paths and get across mountains and things like that, it just wasn't working out perfectly. And he spent so much time trying to get it right. Mm-hmm. And then other people who take his work and don't care about it. That's where I think the big disconnect becomes for fans like us, whereas they just seemed like they didn't care anymore. It's just like the goal is to actually make the special effects look really good, and nothing else matters. Like the acting, the writing, everything else doesn't matter.
They had money, they had time, they had and they couldn't get it right. And I don't, at the end of the day, like I don't pay a lot of attention to like the what's happening now in terms of like the daily leaks from the production or whatever like that.
Me neither.
But I don't necessarily, and maybe I'm wrong in this, but I don't necessarily fault the showrunners, the two guys, whatever their names are. I think they got thrown into it, and somebody like they were like, these two guys want to make a name for themselves. They'll just they'll be useful tools for us corporate powers, right?
Yep.
And I think about like the corporate powers having their hands on Tolkien's works, and I'm like, it's like this is basically Sauron got his hands on Tolkien stories and is now telling the stories.
That's right? They're burning up the Shire. Right?
Yeah, and so and I look back at like Peter Jackson's films, and again, there's issues with Peter Jackson's film. He did not create perfection, but those Lord of the Rings films stand up and are good films in my opinion, and are still very enchanting to me because he was one guy who had a very unique vision, just like Tolkien was, right? Yeah. Just
he
like
had
Tolkien
the passion,
was.
Man.
He did, right? Yeah. And then you look and Rings of Power it's a corporate thing, and it's mediocre and it's marketable and all these kinds of things.
I did a video a while back, like probably in the summer, where it's all these things fail when you don't have a single passionate voice standing up for it. And so you look at Star Wars, even Marvel now, when I think Jon Favreau left, right? There was a voice who was like kind of speaking what it was, and then you lose George Lucas, and now you lose Peter Jackson, or Peter Jackson lost J.R.R. Tolkien, or however you want to look at that. But you lose that passion, and it becomes an exercise in profit. And if it's not going to make a profit, we're just going to kill it, rather than let's make something great. And by default, what should happen is you will actually make money on it, which is what happened. And and which leads us right into where we are now with the upcoming films from Warner Brothers, supposedly set in the Third Age.
Yeah,
but it's that corporate entity, and that's what scares me the most. It's a machine.
Yeah, and to speak to what you're saying, John, I really do. I agree with you 100% about J.D. Payne, whose name has taken on special significance to me, and Patrick McKay, but because I actually
the showrunners.
The two showrunners for Rings of Power. I really do believe that the corporate machine just chose them because they were easy to manipulate. Like they would not have been.
They had no credits under their belt before this.
If they had actually got Jackson back again somehow, and if he had been interested, they would not have liked it, because they wouldn't have been able to push him around the way. So this the same way. No, I'm no fan of the Hobbit movies, but I know that there was also other considerations about Guillermo del Toro's scripts and things that they had to toe the line on, that Jackson had to toe the line on. But anyway, it really is a corporate product, and hence more of a product. I mean, maybe I'm tapping into the Lewis that hideous strength too much, but it's like as if the Nice Corporation made a movie about Tolkien's middle. Like it's so and it doesn't even hold up to its own standards. I mean, for heaven's sake, the prequel to House of the Dragon did way better than Tolkien's work, which has no right to.
But then again, you look at that and you're like, well, House of the Dragon had the original writer involved still, and so there was, even though, and you look at Song of Ice and Fire. What was the song? It's Game of Thrones. I couldn't even remember the name of it. Look at that. Once the person with the passion behind it, the author, was gone, the last 2 seasons just fell into an abyss.
We're terrible. Yeah, I was more, even though I think Martin is a talented writer, I was more comparing, like, at their best, Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, when put into film, they can reach about that high. Tolkien has the potential for an actual good Tolkien film is so much higher, and the fact they managed to achieve this ridiculously low level of interest and like, it didn't even stand up to its own to modern media, let alone his works. So it was a travesty.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how do they fix it in the upcoming films? I mean, they said they're going back to Peter Jackson, but I think, Peter Jackson's kind of been there, done that. I don't think he has that passion anymore, right? That was his magnum opus, doing the Lord of the Rings.
I don't know, man. I don't know.
So here's an example. I don't know. Are either of you guys Star Trek fans?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm a Star Trek fan.
Okay,
yeah.
So Star Trek Picard seasons 1 and 2 were absolute utter trash. They had no business being called Star Trek. Picard was a shell of himself. They had to deal with daddy issues and mommy issues and all this sort of stuff that in Star Trek doesn't mean anything. Star Trek has always been about people coming together, about, Earth was obviously in a utopian format, and based out of that, right, the Federation was trying to do good, and here the whole time, we've got, again, the whole season 2 is based on illegal immigration. Like, nobody in this world wants to see Star Trek based upon illegal immigration in our time. We watch Star Trek to escape, not to actually, like, go look at, like, how bad our political systems are right now.
Wait, you didn't watch Star Trek to see Stacey Abrams as president of the world?
That's another one. She was in Star Trek Discovery. I didn't see that season, but I knew that she was in it. What I want to see is the failed Georgia gubernatorial candidate, right? That's what I want to see. Anyway, but Picard season 3 is actually amazingly good. It is really good. And they got a guy who worked on, I think he worked on The Next Generation. He's like an intern, or he was an assistant or something like that, and kind of stuck with Star Trek. And he worked on, I think, Picard season 2, but that gave him an in to the suits and an in to the actors to go to them. Like, here's my idea for season 3. Here, let's do this. His name is Terry Matalas. And the music is great. They got rid of Jeff Russo, who's an absolutely abysmal conductor or musician. I hate his music. It is all just bland and melodyless. And they got a new guy to kind of like harken back to some of the old themes. And so what they did is they got somebody with some vision, with some passion, and put him in charge of it, and stood back and said, you do whatever you want. And so they completely ignored seasons 1 and 2. They ignored like what Warner Brothers would have to do with some parts of The Hobbit, I think, and would have to do with, obviously, with Rings of Power, which they can do, but they have to ignore what came before and do something with a passion there, and hands off, right? And say, yeah, what? Go ahead, Michael.
However,
that's my okay.
However, I know we brought John on to interview him, and we're just sitting here talking.
I'll jump in eventually.
Yeah, please do run roughshod if you can. And but here's the difference. The thing I love about season 3 of Picard, yes, I agree with you. It's so far it's good. First few episodes are good. Reason it's good is because they brought back Riker, because they brought back Worf, because they're doing it the way.
But it's not just that.
But they're living up to their characters.
Yes.
So here's the thing: they are tapping into something that made Star Trek: The Next Generation good, or at least watchable for most people, and so they have something real to reach back to and say, hey, we're going to make it like this again, because everyone says that our first 2 seasons sucked. And so we're going to take a chance on a twist by like actually going back to the source material that people like. They don't have that option with Rings of Power. This is why I say that, because they can't use the Silmarillion. They can't.
Yeah, I know.
And so, and if they do, they'll get their rear end suit off. So in other words,
my thing was like, well, okay, you've got Appendix B, and some information from Appendix A. So I mean, and apparently they have, permission. They can go to the Tolkien estate and be like, hey, can we use this? Can we use this? Right.
Yeah.
But, my whole thing is like, well, if you can't tell the story the way it needs to be told, then don't tell the story. You could have told another story. You could have done something else.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah.
And,
but $250 million. Come on, John. They spent $250 million. How could they have to do something now? There are a bunch of suits who just spent $250 million on rights. So, I just think they've painted themselves in a corner. I agree with you. You have elements, of course, from the Silmarillion in Appendix A and Appendix B, but you don't have enough. If they start tapping in too much of the Silmarillion, and sure, you could play the lawyer game, but you can't play the lawyer game with the whole thing. And the lawyer games are expensive and time-consuming.
So let's completely write off the Rings of Power and say that's sludge under the bridge. Let's talk about what they're going to do with the films, right? Because that's the real thing. Is like the Rings of Power is like, I don't know how you recover from that unless you take what they made huge and you try to concentrate on one story and make it really interesting. But with Warner Brothers, right? They're gonna supposedly tell stories in the Third Age. They're going to tell stories perhaps of young Aragorn. They're going to tell stories of perhaps the Angmar Wars, with Witch King of Angmar and how they lost Arnor and all. So the whole battle up there, and we'll see Weathertop again and see all that. But how do you that's logistical. That's like, okay, what are we going to do? What kind of person do they need to get involved? Like, are there people still out there? Like, do they need to go outside of the Hollywood industry? And would these guys ever do it, or should we just forget about it?
I honestly,
after the Rings, go ahead.
I honestly don't like. I'm so. Maybe they need to get Vince Gilligan to do it, because he's the only guy I seem to trust these days when it comes to anything, anything in Hollywood. So. I just, there's so few people like that I think are up to the task at this point. It's just all so corporate, and everything is so managed from the top down by people who are they're probably millionaires playing games with each other, and career games with each other, and everybody knows that dynamic that goes on with people just idiots gunning for little fiefdoms within their corporate worlds. And these are the kinds of things that Tolkien stuff is subject to right now, right? Little petty fiefdom arguments. And so I'm like, that probably sounds really pessimistic. I guess the optimist in me will say, I do really hope they can do something great, because I want to see something great. I wanted Rings of Power to be fantastic.
Me too.
You go back to the years leading up to 2022 after they announced it, and I was like super excited. We talked a lot about on the podcast. It wasn't until like that trailer dropped during the Super Bowl, and some of the stuff with like magazine articles and that kind of thing.
And the super fans, remember them?
Oh, I didn't even ever watch. I was done by even the time the super fans thing came out, and I heard about it later on, but I was just like that. It was the nail in the coffin for me, because I was like, you guys are trying way too hard with this, man. Like,
that's the problem with converts to Catholicism like you, is that you haven't absorb the self-flagellation that cradle Catholics have, and so we want the pain at a certain point. We're just like, that's so wrong. I'm gonna watch some more of it. That's terrible.
Hey, I've been Catholic 13 years at Easter, so I'm getting there. I'm starting to pick up on
pick up on the self-flagellation. All right.
I said I watched Rings of Power, all 8 episodes of that first season.
You did. That is a good start. Good start. Yeah. Now you can go and watch Star Trek Discovery.
I mean, what do you guys think of like? All right, so the War of the Rohirrim, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was one that was announced a couple of years ago, and that's like this animated thing. I think it's still supposed to be animated.
Yes, sir.
And I've been saying for a long time that, sorry guys, alarm that goes off after 9.
It's all right.
Mute myself.
It's good. There, gotcha. All right. While John deals with the invaders in his home.
Yeah, I'm just glad he isn't.
Give us a thumbs up, John, when you're ready. Yeah, we're good. This is the. Oh, you're up. Okay, good. It's the pain of the Rings of Power. Stop talking about the Rings of Power. Everybody knows it sucks. Just move on.
That's true. You set an alarm on your computer. If Rings of Power is brought up too many times, it just starts going off.
So that was Jeff Bezos sounding off the alarm, talking too much smack about the Rings of Power.
The alarm. It's the Rings of Power mode.
I'm watching. I'm listening.
Oh gosh, so true.
So War of the Rohirrim. I have been of the opinion for a while that I could see a bright future in high quality animation for adapting Tolkien's works, and I think he would have been amenable to that idea. He has a quote where he says he alludes to this illustrator, I think it's Raskin over Disney, right? He's like Raskin rather than Disney, right? And you look up this Raskin's artwork, illustrator from the early mid 20th century, and it's really interesting, stuff. It's really beautiful stuff. So I'm really excited to see what happens with this War of the Rohirrim. I think maybe they need to tell stories where there's just 5 sentences and that's all you know about it, right?
Yeah.
And
and that means they're short stories. They're not trying to make something huge and encompassing all of Middle Earth again.
Exactly,
which I think is
right?
a much better approach.
It's almost like they tried to bite off more than they could chew, and it feels in a way like Star Wars. The thing that happened with Star Wars with the sequels was a similar thing where it's like they tried to dive right back into this to this thing, and after all these years, and they needed to build to it instead.
Well, they did mention, I think the word that the CEO of Warner Brothers said was the Middle Earth Cinematic Universe. I think that was kind of in maybe not in those direct terms, but the idea of that, like, we're going to build a universe around all this now. I'm like, oh no.
But just do one good thing, and then
I know.
Then
think of how incredible it could be if they did get the right person, which they won't. I mean, I'm a pessimist, so I'm sure they won't. But if they did, and you built a cinematic universe around it, and you did that thing like you were saying, John, where you just made sure that you told one story at a time. You were taking a very small story in the text, whether those are the appendices or the Silmarillion, and you just do that one, and you make sure you try to be as Tolkien-esque as possible about it, and that's it. I mean, the worst thing that they set themselves up for failure, aside from the unbelievable lack of actual writing talent that reared its head in the Rings of Power, there was the fact that they were set themselves to fail from the first because of their time compression designs. It was just
the time compression is the thing I've harped on most. I'm like, this is you don't understand. You just don't understand Tolkien if you think that's okay. Like, you just don't get it.
Wow.
You don't get it.
Well, we can talk about this for a very, very long time, but we'll do that in our extended podcast now. But which you can get to by going to theonering.com/patron, where you can join us and not actually pay Patreon or YouTube the additional 30% that they take. So it's actually cheaper there. But you can go to YouTube and become a member. You click the join button next to the subscribe button or somewhere around there. Anyway, it's below the video. I don't know, somewhere.
We want to give John a chance to tell us.
No, John doesn't get to. Nope, we're done. Sorry, John, you don't get to tell us. Of course.
Oh, that's good. More self-flagellation.
Yeah, so go there for that. And if you want John, tell us where we can get your podcast, obviously podcasts and things like that, and but also your books. And I know you sell other stuff, and you have a Patreon and all that good stuff.
Yeah. I got a Patreon, patreon.com/Tolkien Road. TolkienRoad.com for basically everything else. My books. I was actually going to mention this one earlier. So this Tolkien's Overture. This is a book about the music of the Ainur, and there you go.
Yes,
up close and personal.
I want that
book about the music of the Ainur, Lindale, and it goes into an exploration of music in Middle Earth and how music is like this. Substance that Middle Earth seems to be made out of within the Legendarium. So that would be the central thesis of that one. This is my short book about Beren and Luthien right there.
Tolkien's Requiem.
Yeah.
Which one should we start with first?
Well, Tolkien's Requiem is very short, and it's about Beren and Luthien. And so I tell people it's a great way to, it's like a backdoor into the Silmarillion, because the story of Beren and Luthien is maybe the most, it's maybe the most digestible story within the Silmarillion for the first time reader. A person who's just come from the Lord of the Rings, because Sauron plays a big role in it. So you've got a character you recognize right there, right up front. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful story. Very dynamic, beautiful story. A lot of action. Just good stuff.
Yeah.
So anyway, Tolkien's Requiem is that kind of ties the whole Silmarillion story together with using Beren and Luthien as a frame of reference.
And you can go to tolkiensrequiem.com. Nice. You bought the domain. Good job, coming from a web developer for the last 20 years. Before you bought you published the book, you probably bought the domain, right?
Probably. Maybe I didn't really get to start
just
too
say
much
yes.
of the web
Just
development.
say yes.
Yes. Self-explanation.
right. Yeah, we'll link the books below, the podcast, the Patreon, all that sort of stuff. And we'll have to do this more often. Like I want to keep conversations going, because it's nice to hear other people's perspective on things too, because sometimes we get into our own heads for too much and we'll just keep harping on the Rings of Power in the same way over and over and over again, because it's so easy, or talking about the same thing in Lord of the Rings so much.
It is kind of fun to harp on the Rings of Power, though. There's some kind of perverse satisfaction that comes from that.
By the way, I'm with you. I'm with you about the story of Helm Hammerhand. That's in the anime version. I have some hope for that story.
Stop talking. We'll talk about it in the extended podcast.
Oh, right.
Come
Sorry,
on.
my bad.
Jeez. All right.
You got to get rid of the freeloaders first.
Yeah, that's right. We're gonna head over there. So yeah, go to thewonder.com/patron to get that. And you get it on YouTube, and you can get it in your podcast app of choice. So we're going to head over into there. Thanks, John, for joining us. It's good seeing you, Michael. And I'll see you guys right here on the other side.